Hello, everyone, and welcome to Net Zero Week, brought to you by YPO and iNetwork. I'm Shelley Heckman, iNetwork Partnership Director, and I shall be facilitating today's webinar titled Towards a Net Zero Public Sector, Where Are We Now? This is the opening panel of the Net Zero Week, and this session will set the context for the week's activities by speaking with colleagues across local government and the NHS to reflect on why decarbonisation is a top priority for the sector. We'll be looking at what's been achieved so far and where we are now with a focus on the role of public procurement. I am super delighted to be joined today by our guest speakers. First, we have Peter Leeton-Jones, who is a Senior Climate Change Programme Manager from Wakefield Council. Would you give us a wave? Heidi Barnard, Group Head of Sustainability at Northern Care Alliance at NHS Group. And we also have John Emmett, Senior Policy and Programme Officer from Programme Officer of Sustainable Development, sorry about that, from Greater London Authority. And we also should be joined by Michael Sellers from Star Procurement, but I think he's having some technical problems. Fingers crossed that he'll be able to join us in the course of the session. Before we do start, I do have a couple of housekeeping items to mention before we begin. So as you can see, there's a chat box on the side of your screen where you can submit any questions that you might have for the panel, and we'll try to answer your questions at the end of the session. Depending on how many questions there are, we might not have time to answer them all, but we will follow them up by email after the Net Zero Week if we don't get to them all. You can also use the menu item on the top left of your screen, don't know whether that is, for you to navigate back to the event agenda where you can see all the upcoming webinars. And if you want to register for any more webinars, please do follow the link at the bottom of that screen. So let's begin. I'd like to start with Peter. Peter, could you briefly just tell us who you are and what your role entails at Wakefield Council?
Yes, certainly. So good morning to everyone. My name's Peter Leeton-Jones. I'm the Climate Change Programme Manager at Wakefield Council. Just to give you a bit of context about my background, I have been working in the sustainability field for 16 years, specifically within a local government setting. It's been a very diverse role, really. I've done a lot with sustainable procurement, energy efficiency, retrofits, EV infrastructure, and also renewables as well. Here in Wakefield, I'm responsible for the delivery of the net zero programs that we have. So obviously, like many other local authorities and organisations, we declared a climate emergency in May 2019. And off the back of that, we've been developing various programs of work to help deliver net zero aspirations, both for the organisation in the context of a journey towards 2030 carbon neutrality, but also in respect of the Wakefield district as a whole. And obviously there's a distinction to make there because as an organisation, we have control over our emissions and what we do to address them. When it comes to the district, it's more of a facilitation and enabling role. We obviously, as a local authority, we have a lot of power and influence across the district in terms of being a planning authority, highways related schemes, regen, etc. So it's fairly obvious that we should take a leadership role in terms of that net zero journey as well. The time frame for that is probably a bit longer, but we'll go into more detail as we get into this session, I'm sure.
Thank you, Peter. We're also joined by Heidi. Hi, Heidi. It's lovely to have you join us today. What do you do as Group Head of Sustainability at Northern Care Alliance?
So my role covers environmental sustainability, so emissions, energy, water, waste, and biodiversity. Most people aren't probably familiar with the fact that as a large estate owning enterprise, we do have a lot of environmental, legislative, as well as goals that we're trying to achieve in terms of doing no harm. And again, we'll go into that in more detail as we go through the sessions today.
Thank you, Heidi, and welcome, John. Could you say a few words of introduction about you and your role?
Morning. Yeah, sure. So I'm here wearing two hats today. I work for the environment team of the Greater London Authority, and so I'm here in my role as providing the secretariat function for the London Sustainable Development Commission, which advises the mayor on sustainability. The LSDC have a long-standing piece of work to report on London's sustainable development, not just on the environment side, but on social and economic factors as well. And we published a report in March on London's performance against the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's been really important in highlighting the way that climate and environment, but also community and social and democratic and economic issues are all very much interlinked. And the evidence that we brought to light through that report shows the benefits to local authorities of embracing that holistic approach in decision making in order to reduce inequalities, to empower local communities to take part in local decision making, to unleash more partnership working, and the role of the SDGs as well through that global recognition to sort of help engage with stakeholders, especially stakeholders through procurement and corporates. The other part of my role is on responsible procurement. So the GLA group comprises not just City Hall, but also Transport for London, the Metropolitan Police, Fire Brigade, and some other bodies. And so we have a programme to use that £8.5 billion of annual public spend to deliver public goods for Londoners. We can come on to the details of that later on.
Thank you, John, and we really appreciate those two hats for today's discussion. Absolutely. So over the course of this week, I think we're going to hear a lot of talks about environmental sustainability, net zero, carbon neutral, lots of buzzwords, just to set the scene for us all so that I guess we have a shared understanding of what we mean, at least in this conversation, of the term. In a nutshell, I think maybe I'll go to you, Peter. Are you able to describe what we mean by net zero, or at least what you mean by net zero when we're talking about it today?
I will attempt to answer that question, yes, because it is a very broad definition depending on who you speak to. But I suppose if you can distill it into some kind of definition, it's an aspiration to balance emissions at a point of carbon neutrality at some point in the future for whatever emissions are within the boundary of the baseline that you set. So there's a process initially to look at your emissions baseline, to set that baseline, to look at carbon budgets, and then to think of the sorts of interventions that you want to make as an organisation. In terms of application, it can be really applied to any organisation or business, in fact, no matter what the size is, as well as geographical areas as well, such as city and even countries. Sorry, there's a bit of typing feedback from somebody in the background. I just wanted to mention that in case other people can hear it. But in terms of what we're talking about, there are different scopes of emissions. There's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions are direct organisational emissions. So you're talking about the natural gas used within your building estate and also the petrol and diesel used within your fleet vehicles, if you have fleet vehicles. Scope 2, indirect, but specifically around the electricity supplied into the properties that you run your business out of. And scope 3 are indirect emissions, but specifically the supply chain emissions upstream and downstream of the organisation. And when most people talk about net zero, primarily they're fixating on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions because that's where you have the control. When you look at scope 3 emissions, it's more difficult. So business travel is one that's quite easy to quantify, as well as some other types of scope 3 emissions. But when you're looking at procurement, it is complicated, but it's really important that you do at least try and qualify what you're doing from a scope 3 emissions perspective, because they can often account for 80% of your overall real baseline. So that's not the baseline you're reporting on, but what your actual baseline is when you look at your supply chain, because a lot of organizations obviously outsource their service delivery to third parties. But if you did try and quantify some of those emissions, you would get cases of double counting as well, because your scope 3 emissions might be somebody else's scope 1 emissions. So it can be complicated, I suppose. But as long as you define it clearly, what's in scope in terms of the scopes of emissions, then at least you're being transparent. I think when it comes to things like offsetting to make that balance, because there are trade-offs to be made. There'll be some residual emissions probably that are hard to treat, which is why we talk about net zero, this balance. So when you're talking about heat, that's hard to decarbonize. Some vehicle classes are hard to decarbonize. So there's always going to be a need to look at offsetting, but it should be the last option on the hierarchy, really, because you have less control. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. When you're talking about offsets, usually it's tree planting that's involved. But obviously, if you plant a new tree and it's a sapling, it takes decades before it's sequestering carbon to the degree that you might need to quantify those offsets. So it's not a panacea, it's part of the equation. But what you should be doing is focusing on carbon reduction in the first instance, and also things like behaviour change and avoidance of emissions at source, where you can do that. So a bit of a meandering answer, but hopefully that gives a bit of context.
Thank you, John. Would you agree? Do you have anything to add to Peter's definition? It was quite robust.
Certainly, yeah. I certainly wouldn't have anything to add in terms of a very comprehensive definition of carbon management. The only thing I might throw into the mix there is the sort of thinking that we might bring in, expand that scope even further to think about the community impact, the sort of economic impact, and how we sort of approach our management and measurement to sort of suit those. So, for example, we know that if we take action to reduce energy consumption in homes, that can help alleviate fuel poverty. It can have public health benefits, for example. We know that there are a whole number of challenges to innovative suppliers of clean tech solutions from supplying the public sector. So how can we be a bit creative about how we unblock some of those barriers, and more widely how we learn some of the lessons that we've been seeing coming through from the pandemic in terms of the sort of need for more people-centered thinking around balancing our sort of lives, the environment, the economy, the way we work, the way we live. So yeah, that's a difficult thing to sort of bring into one pot, but that's probably the direction I think our thinking needs to sort of evolve into.
Thank you, John. And I see that we've been joined by Michael. Welcome. Let's test your audio. Can you hear and see us? And can we hear you?
I can, yeah. Yeah, can you hear
Wonderful. Yes, we can. Just for our audience, we've done introductions, but I'd love to introduce you. Could you tell us briefly who you are and also, what is Star Procurement and what your role is?
Yes, yeah. So I'm a business partner within Star Procurement, and we are a shared procurement service between Rochdale, Stockport, Tameside, and Trafford councils. So we obviously run all their procurement activity for everything that they need. My role in Star, I look after growth, but I also work in the development team. So I kind of help influence and push our improvement agenda and how we do things differently.
Thank you, Michael. We were just doing a little bit of scene setting and asking the question around what is the topic. If I could go back to Peter for a second. As a non-subject matter expert, I think there are lots of different dates and timescales across numerous parts of the sector that can be quite confusing. What are some of the specific goals or targets that we in the public sector have to meet?
Yeah, so obviously the overarching legislation is pertinent to note in terms of the Climate Change Act, which has been set by central government, that agenda, which is 2050. But obviously a lot of detractors of that will say that that's far too late. They've tried to take a balanced emissions pathway. A lot of historical work has gone into formulating that target, I suppose, but a lot of organisations specifically in much shorter timeframes to achieve net zero. And I think where you do have that control, it is achievable to look at dates like 2030 for specific organisations, depending on what type of resources you have to enable that, really. The larger organisations, especially both public and private, it should be within the realms of possibility to look at that. When we're talking about local government and district boundaries, I think it gets a bit more complex because some people, local authorities, I mean, we've got an aspiration to target 2030, but I don't think the conditions yet exist to make that a reality. So when you look at legislation, policy, funding, all of those types of things, it's not quite there yet. And also market readiness. If we all tried to buy heat pumps, for example, there wouldn't be the supply to meet demand. So there's a lot of structural changes that need to happen to unlock some of these dates. But a lot of work is happening between peer organisations, combined authorities, mayoral systems to look at what might happen in respect of reducing that timeline that central government has set. So I think 2040 might be a compromise in terms of meeting a certain date. The issue we have is when you look at the climate science, it's saying that we should be achieving net zero far, far earlier, potentially before 2030. But then in terms of pragmatism and realism, we're not anywhere close to being at that point. If we wanted to reach those targets, we would have to have some kind of response globally, much like what we've seen with the pandemic, which we're not really seeing that sort of conversation happen yet. But when you look at the carbon budgets that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change set in 2018, tied to this pathway where we're trying to reduce the risk of a 1.5 degree temperature increase by the end of this century, then the carbon budget they set will be expended based on current emissions globally within probably 6, 7, 8 years. So then we'll be going to the next boundary, which is 2 degrees. So it's very complex, I think. And the difficulty is that obviously we're targeting something that doesn't really fit in with the science in terms of the dates, but we're doing it based on what we know is possible, based on the framework that we live and operate within. So I think big changes are needed if we're going to achieve some of those earlier dates, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour for what's in scope.
Thank you. I think that's quite the challenge, isn't it? Heidi, can I come to you? I think there are a lot of colleagues here that joining us for this session and for this week. They're not explicitly local government or procurement people. Could you explain in your view why decarbonisation is important to the NHS?
Yeah, certainly. So I think I'll summarise first and then go into detail. Prevention is better than cure. So decarbonisation is a response to climate change. It's about how do we stop the worst effects of climate change. And climate change not only poses a threat to the planet, but it's also a health concern. So we talk about a climate crisis, we also talk about it in the context of being a health crisis. If we don't do something about it, we're going to end up seeing more poor environmental health conditions, more major diseases. Things like cardiac problems, asthma, and cancer are all linked to climate change to some degree or other. And there's kind of two elements to it as well. There's the NHS in terms of its direct impact, but also its influence. We employ 1.3 million people. We see and touch millions of people around the country. And if we can't do something and help influence, then who can? We are probably one of the best sources of face-to-face and one-on-one contact that we're likely to have. There's also the fact that our actual emissions themselves are not insignificant. There's a report that was issued in October 2018 called Delivering a Net Zero Health Service, and in that it estimates that the NHS is responsible for around 4 to 5% of the UK's total emissions. And when we start to talk about things like air emissions and transport and travel, again, the NHS is a significant contributor to that because the amount of people and stuff we are moving on a daily basis.
Thank you. And I guess from a procurement perspective, I'd like to go to Michael. How does that tie in from a procurement perspective, and what is the role of public procurement in encouraging sustainable development and zero carbon growth?
Yeah, so our 4 partners have all declared climate emergencies, and they have an ambition or goal of 2038 to become carbon neutral. And when we think our 4 partners we have an influential spend around £1 billion between them per year. So it's a lot of public money that's spent, and obviously there's therefore a lot of good that can be done with that. And the supply chains that within the boroughs and obviously further afield. So like Heidi said as well, one of their ambitions obviously is healthy lives, healthy people within their boroughs. So reducing the carbon emissions within their boroughs obviously will have a knock-on effect with healthy lives. So public procurement can have a pivotal role in securing reductions in carbon, both in terms of what we buy and how we buy it, and then also how our suppliers can. Sorry, I got Heidi's cat distracting me. And how our suppliers can help and change how they perhaps supply the services and goods within our boroughs. So say it's a lot of spend that potentially has a lot of influence.
Yeah, that's clearly a message I'm hearing from both you and Heidi. There's you can have the public sector can have such a massive impact, particularly because of the spend of those sectors. So I want to sort of go to you both. Actually, maybe you, Michael, first. We'll continue with you. So knowing that, so what are some of the things that your organisation is doing actually to address the decarbonisation agenda from a procurement perspective?
Yeah. So we've developed a responsible procurement strategy, and within there are carbon emissions and how we obviously affects how we buy and what we buy. So within that we look to use the government's buying standards where possible. Now they've not been updated for a number of years, so there's obviously limitations in what they can support with. So we I suppose are now trying to work with the services in terms of challenging specifications. So perhaps trying to change what it is they're asking for, but without gold plating contracts, because obviously that's going to cost more. So it's kind of managing that balance between influencing and getting greener services and products, but not buying something over and above what we actually need. And then one other way we're trying to do that is through social value. So in a way, pushing some of that onto a joint approach with suppliers. So how can they support us? So we have weightings in our award criteria. We use something called TOMS, so the Themes Outcome Measures, which is a national framework. We kind of call it a menu. So suppliers can kind of pick from that menu as to what they think they are able to do, and then that obviously helps. Influences the outcome of a tender process, tender exercise. But it's a way we can work with our suppliers in a way that's reasonable and proportionate to the contract.
Thank you, Michael. And Heidi, could you tell us a little bit more about the journey that the NHS has been on in the past few years and what some of the key achievements have been in terms of decarbonisation?
Yeah, certainly. So 10 years ago, the NHS published its carbon reduction strategy, and there's been a lot focus on estate in that 10 years. So things like the LED lighting replacement. There's been a lot of investment in how we actually power our hospitals. So some of you will not be aware that we still had coal power, steam, and we still have steam power in a lot of our hospitals. So again, how do we get to net zero when we're still in some of the most polluting forms? So again, there's been a lot of investment in upgrading the energy performance of the sites. Increasingly over the last few years, that started to shift, not just to think about our direct kind of on-site emissions, but also the impact of our supply chain. So things like the emissions from medical gases, anesthetics, and inhalers. But the real kind of turning point was last year. In January 2020, there was a campaign for a greener NHS was launched. And that was a group that was put together of industry experts to come up with what the route map looked like. We had a number of trusts all kind of going off and doing their own kind of plan. In Greater Manchester, it was 2038. In other areas of the country, it was different dates. But how do we bring the whole of the NHS into line and kind of really get some momentum behind it? So that group published, as I mentioned earlier, in October 2020, which was impressive on a number of fronts, mainly because we're obviously dealing with the COVID pandemic during that time, and it wasn't felt that this was something we could stand down. It was as important, if not more important, for the future to be preparing for the next phase of what this life is going to look like. Within that report, there are two targets. There is one for direct emissions, and we've got a date of 2040, but also so we were talking earlier about scope 3, and we even talk about scope 3 plus. So this is the really difficult to measure and difficult to do stuff. Our date for that is 2045. So we're not shying away from it. We are going to tackle it. So there's a number of activities and actions across various areas of the organisation. And as I said before, the initial work was very much looking at the estates, which only accounts really for about 24-25% of our overall emissions. So there's still a lot of work to do there, but there's so much else we can do as well. And again, we talk about supply chain. That's over 60% of our footprint. So how on earth do we change our own behaviours, but also what the materials that we're buying and using every day, day in, day out, how do we influence them to kind of help on this journey?
And I think that question, that's really crux to what we're trying to answer this week, and it's not a easy question to answer, is it? Peter, I think since 2008, Wakefield Council has reduced their carbon emissions by, I think, 15,000 tonnes I've got here. Clearly, that shows that decarbonisation has been a major priority for your local authority. Could you tell us a little bit more about the journey Wakefield Council is on with regards to tackling climate change?
Yeah, I suppose it's important to note that actually a lot of organisational carbon emission reductions have been quite passive over the last decade or so, because a lot's been going on in terms of grid decarbonisation. If you look at things like offshore wind and the transition away from coal towards natural gas as an electricity source, that has helped matters, I think, without us having to do a great deal, if I'm completely honest. It's the same with vehicles when you look at the EU engine emission standards that came in. So Euro 3, 4, 5, 6, sequentially better standards that have reduced emissions from fleets. And then the other thing, when you're thinking about the public sector specifically, is austerity and the shrinkage of estates, public estates, as there's been building rationalisation as well. So, yeah, I don't want to take all the credit for those emissions reductions that have happened in the past, but I think what's going on now is really positive in terms of, obviously, we had the climate emergency declarations and a lot has changed in the last 2 years. We're light years ahead of where we were. And actually, whether you like their methods or not, they can be controversial. Extinction Rebellion had a big hand in this movement that we're now experiencing, which I think is positive. So the onus is now for all organisations, including Wakefield, on shifting away from rhetoric, vacuous talk all of the time about what we're going to do. We've laid the foundations. Now it's about moving towards the action and implementation phase. So that's what we're trying to do. And there is a huge commitment within the organisation now. I can see it every day in terms of service areas coming to me and asking me what we can do differently to reduce emissions in key areas, really. But in terms of what we're trying to do as an organisation, I suppose, to draw a line in the sand is look at some of the big ticket items that we can lead on. So we do have some agricultural ownings, which is quite low grade agricultural land. A lot of leases are up for renewal. There's obviously things happening in the farming industry, so land use changes, subsidies, etc. So some land will come back into our possession, and what we're trying to do is build some energy parks, primarily solar, but with co-located batteries and potentially wind, and that will cover off our scope 2 emissions. We think we can install at least 50 megawatts of capacity, and that would deal with 70% of our overall baseline. But alongside that, we're looking at energy efficiency retrofits. So we obviously, like every organisation, major organisation, have a long-term maintenance plan. So when we're looking at assets and what needs to happen in certain buildings, when boiler replacement cycles come up, then we need to be thinking about not putting new boilers in, even if it's in the relative short term. We need to be shifting towards these newer technologies, things like heat pumps, for example. Could we tap into district heat networks that are tied to mine water heat extraction, for example? Because this district that I reside in has got a lot of potential when it comes to old coal mining infrastructure, which could be leveraged. That industry was a dirty industry of the past. It, kickstarted the Industrial Revolution. So Wakefield actually contributed to a lot of the emissions we see now and the problems that we're facing. But now we can shift that and turn it 180 and make it back into a positive, potentially, to feed mine water heat into housing, into our own buildings, agricultural sheds to relocalize food production. There's all sorts of things going on. It's when you look at the district as a whole, it becomes more complex because obviously we've got an economic paradigm based on capitalism and growth, and we need to be shifting more towards, I won't say degrowth, but things like donor economics and looking at the sustainable development goals and trying to make it more holistic. So not just viewing progress as being growth in hard figures, just, money swishing around in the economy. It should be more about prosperity, education, health, happiness, those types of metrics. But it's a big shift in mindset, really. And I know we're going to probably talk about challenges at some point in this session. So I'll leave it at that for now. But there are lots of things happening within the organisation, and it's positive. But there's still a long journey to go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Hold that thought, John, around sort of that growth model, because I think it'd be really good to explore in just a bit. But before, sorry, Peter, but before that, John, I'd like to sort of go to you really, because you do have a view of what organisations are doing in London, in the London area. So what are some of the areas of decarbonisation that have been prioritised, and to what extent do you think that the organisations have gone for the quick wins first?
Yeah, so the Mayor of London has set a 2030 zero carbon target for the city, and on a policy level, some of the policies that is put in place to start delivering that are the ultra low emission zone, which is mainly geared around local air quality. It's cut nitrogen dioxide pollution by around a third in central London, but that will also have significant impacts on carbon. The Energy for Londoners programme has retrofitted in the region of 27,000 homes and public sector buildings, and the public sector buildings alone have saved over 12,000 tonnes of carbon per year. The London Plan, which is the sort of strategic planning strategy for the city, now requires new developments to achieve carbon savings of 40.6% higher than are required by the national building regulations. And between 2016 and early 2020, planning applications that have gone directly to the mayor and been referred to him have secured an additional 21.7 megawatts of solar panels, which equates to an investment of around sort of 26 million pounds. So there's a as I think Heidi was making that point that we have that sort of opportunity for impact at scale, and I think that's important. In terms of our own operations, the responsible procurement program for the GLA group, which, as I say, is covers some of the London's bodies like the fire brigade and the police. We've mapped our supply chain emissions and found that our development program, especially within Transport for London, construction is a huge proportion of that. So we've been focusing our efforts there primarily. There's a new action plan which we'll be launching next month, which I won't go into the details of, but there'll be a lot more in there to really push our suppliers to help contribute to our carbon targets. And I was really interested to see last week the government's announcement that any new supplier for a government contract of over £5 million will be required to meet the government's 2050 carbon target. And I think that new approach is really going to start having is going to help us a lot, because it will help us all be sort of pushing in the same direction, and suppliers will be getting that sort of message from a number of different places. And I think that feeds into a wider point around coordination and partnership, which I know we'll probably pick up a little bit later in the piece. And another couple of areas that we've been working on is some of those bits that Peter identified around the connections between environment and other areas of the economy. So, for example, green skills. We've known for a while that building green jobs and skills is crucial, and we're only just now starting to get into what that looks like in practice and getting a definition for, is a green job something which is literally building a solar panel or something, or is it something about making all jobs greener? And that's something that we're looking to develop over the next few years, and bringing those all into line with our drive towards improving employment conditions, in particular by sort of pushing suppliers to pay the London living wage, by driving transparent and ethical supply chains throughout our procurement. So those are some of the key things that we've been working on in London.
Thank you, John. I mean, you've all thrown up some really sort of big targets and the challenge we can see is quite great. And I guess I'd like to focus a little bit about the challenges. Heidi, would you be able to sort of tell us a little bit more about what are some, from your perspective, what are some of the main challenges or obstacles that we really need to overcome to be able to meet some of those targets that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, certainly. So for me, the two I'm going to concentrate on, one's really tangible, something about, one's a bit more ethereal. So the first one is about the decarbonisation of heat. We talk a lot about decarbonisation, we talk about renewable technologies and electricity, but actually we use far more gas, CHP, steam than we do electricity. And that is, when it comes to just the vast volume that we use and the amount of heating we are doing, it's all well and good to say we're going to electrify it. But if we do, we then run into the tangible issue of, do we have enough capacity? Is there enough electrical generation to be able to decarbonise our heat? So it's a real tangible physical problem of, I'd love to do it, but there's physical constraints to do that at the minute, and we need to think differently about how we heat our buildings. The second one is for bigger challenge, and the more ethereal one is about people's behaviours and that whole total emissions piece. So our direct emissions and the stuff we can do something about, like heat and electricity, but what about everything we buy and the behaviours of a person who either works for us or interacts with us on a daily basis, be it from how you travel to the site if you need to come to site, be it making sure you put your waste in the waste receptacle if we have the right waste receptacle, to actually when we're making decisions about buying an MRI unit or building a new building or which dressings we buy, are we able to make conscious choices to something that actually helps deliver net zero, or do we mindlessly buy what we've always bought, what we think is the best thing based on price or value, rather than making informed or choices about what we're doing? And I think that is the real tough nut to crack. And again, because of the size and huge bandwidth of people that we interact with, you've got to message that in millions of different ways to be able to touch with them in a way that is meaningful for them and tangible for them. And that is a huge challenge.
No, I couldn't agree more there. Peter, from your perspective, what else would you say are challenges? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd reiterate those points. I think they're two of the biggest ones. I'm sure we could all come up with a list of about 20, but I can think of a few others that are probably worth mentioning. Funding is one of them. It's gone very competitive in terms of the route. So if you look at what's happening with Salix, most of you, I'm sure, are aware of what Salix do in terms of providing energy efficiency loans or interest-free energy efficiency loans into the public sector, or that's what they used to do. Now it's switching to a grant-based system, which requires applications. It's very time-consuming putting together those applications and resource-intensive, and there's a big risk that you get no money. So for all of that work you put in, you might not get anything in return, whereas the loan system was really good in terms of giving you that surety. So I don't think it's a good thing that we're going down this route of competitive grant applications to do a lot of this work, because it doesn't play into the hands of smaller organisations that just won't have the capacity to do that, and it worries me a lot. The other thing is the timescales attached to these funding applications, which frankly are ridiculous at times, not realistic at all. So that's one thing. Resourcing, which is linked to that, is another. So I think there's a risk that we duplicate effort. So if you look at it from a local authority perspective, we're all doing very similar things, but we're doing them in silos quite often. There might be some regional cross-working, but very rarely do we pull together and actually procure things together to create frameworks that we can then call off from. Obviously, we've got the purchasing consortia like YPO, who I think are really essential in terms of this journey, because procurement is difficult in terms of people don't have the capacity to support a lot of these fairly novel schemes that we're all going to have to do in the coming years. So that's important. I think looking at it through my lens as well, housing is a really crucial area to decarbonise, obviously. But when we're looking at the planning authority specifically, we're bound by certain national rules tied to the national planning policy framework, which means that we can't stipulate standards that would ensure that new houses built now are net zero ready. So we're building houses now that will need to be retrofitted within the next 20 years at high cost to the people living in those homes, which I think is unfair, and it's also a bit of a nonsense position, but our hands are tied to a certain extent. And then when you look at existing housing stock, which is even more important in terms of the retrofitting that's required, we need to retrofit, I think, 1.5 homes every minute for the next 30 years to meet the targets. And we're so far behind on that journey that it's a real issue. And then just a couple of very small, minor, well, not minor, but final ones. Embodied carbon is a bit of an elephant in the room when we're looking at new infrastructure, that no one's really considering embodied carbon. So when we're looking at a new road building scheme, it's all about modal shift. So the operational emissions might be lower, but no one's thinking about the carbon that's going in to all of those building materials. The same with new housing developments, etc. So I think that's a missing part of the equation. And then one final one is around technological silver bullets, and the fact that some things, for example, hydrogen, might not come along for 20 years, and we can't really wait for those things to become commercially viable. There are existing technologies available now, and we need to embrace those if we're going to meet these targets, really. The same when you look at carbon capture and storage, it linked to things like hydrogen generation from steam methane reformation. So it's complicated, but I think everything exists that we need now. It's all about mindsets, avoiding duplication of effort, looking at resourcing, those types of things. Because when you think about funding as well, one very final thing is that the borrowing costs, the cost of borrowing, are very low at the moment for the public sector specifically. It's more of a challenge for the smaller companies that don't have access to those same things. But within the public sector, we don't really have any excuses for not. Obviously, it depends how risk averse you are, but when the interest rate is 1.5%, we've got far more options available to us in terms of big infrastructure projects to decarbonise. So I'll leave it at that for now, but hopefully that's helpful.
Absolutely. And, both you and Heidi talked about that mindset and entrenched behaviours. And I want to just go back to that point that you made earlier, Peter, around, one of the key challenges being that faced environmental impact is the traditional economic growth model. I wonder if I could sort of go to John. To what extent do you think, Peter's touched on it already, but to what extent do you think that this is still a challenge for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that we can't just carry on running the economy in the way that we do and digging stuff out of the ground, throwing it away, continuing to pollute, to release carbon emissions. So we need to somehow decouple the way that we live from increasing carbon emissions. And we know that that is also linked to other ways that the status quo can't continue to function. And that the pandemic, we know, has shone a light on a whole number of underlying inequalities and exacerbated them. We know that just purely in terms of the mortality rate of COVID, the extent to which that disproportionately harmed BAME communities and frontline workers especially with insecure employment status. In London, there's around about 28% of people live in relative poverty, and the universal credit applications went up by they doubled, but the poorest boroughs saw 5 times more new applications than the wealthiest boroughs. So that we know there's a whole number of connected things that we need to address here. And one of we published a paper last July, the LSDC, on how the Sustainable Development Goals can contribute to creating a greener, fairer recovery, and highlighted the issue of green space in particular, where we know that we estimate it saves the NHS something like £850 billion a year in the way that it just on a sort of low key way helps people with mental and physical health. But we know that there was huge unequal access to that green space, which was really highlighted when people were all kind of stuck indoors. And if you've got a back garden and versus if you've got a large family in a small place with no outdoor space, it's a completely different situation to be stuck in. So addressing those inequalities, I think, is going to be fundamental. I also mentioned that point around retrofitting, just as an example of the way that we can help use sort of holistic sustainable development thinking to identify the sort of win-wins between social community benefits, whilst also helping us to sort of manage any sort of trade-offs that we might need to make. And I think there's that works at that very big picture sort of global scale, but it also works in terms of quite quotidian challenges that we come up to, on a daily basis. Things like siloed working in our organizations, and how do we kind of break down the barriers between between us and our procurement teams and our sort of strategy teams and our transport teams and all these different colleagues and ways of working and between organizations. There's clearly a lot of thinking that needs to be done, but I'm optimistic that some of those discussions are really starting to be taking place now in a way that perhaps we weren't seeing and weren't really feeling in the same way maybe 18 months ago. So I do hope that those conversations continue.
That's it feels a little bit. It feels like a optimistic. I'm just going to come to Michael to bring you into the conversation. Would you agree that we are seeing maybe a move, perhaps a move away from that traditional economic growth mindset towards a more of a balancing of sort of economic, social, and environmental benefits? Particularly, I know that you were talking about the social value earlier on.
Yes, yes, so I would agree. I mean, social value as a concept, I suppose, is quite old now, but I think that there's definitely been over the last few years an increase, I think, in how social value perhaps is used and embedded into procurement. So I know in local authorities, for example, it's very common now that whereas the Social Value Act only applies to above threshold procurements, within local authorities we tend to now look at social value regardless of the actual value of the contract. So we're trying to incorporate it and tackle those issues. So certainly within our 4 partners, for example, if anything over £25,000, we're trying to look at how those issues can be addressed and tackled within our boroughs. Central government have issued quite a few public procurement policy notes recently. Some are only specific to central government, but again, they're pushing social value and how that's embedded, so kind of like reminders or things like that within departments. And then they've also released last week, or it might have been the week before, the National Procurement Policy Statement, and then that's got specific reference to social, economic, and environmental factors as a key targets. That these are things that we all now need to consider, and then and that policy comes into effect basically as of last week, and then they'll be introducing legislation to make sure we kind of reference the policy. So there's definitely been a few things in the last few weeks that central government are now pushing and trying to make sure that we take these, and I think partly for this 2050 target of carbon neutral. So there's definitely been huge improvements, perhaps, but I think some authorities still only look at it above the relevant legislative threshold, and even then others, even within central government, it's really high value. So I think John mentioned earlier something about £5 million or turnover and things like that, £5 million contract. So there's I think there's more to go, further to go, sorry, in that respect of why those thresholds, why not lower those, to catch smaller companies, and actually smaller companies perhaps are better placed in some instances to help deliver these objectives.
And clearly, this is such a big. I mean, we've talked about the challenges. They're huge, and it's actually also a global issue. It's we're seeing an increasing number of countries make some really ambitious targets that we've heard about, and they're backed with some fairly significant investments. However, questions are still being asked by some about whether decarbonisation is happening fast enough. I know we've already talked about that. Is it happening fast enough? Are we meeting those? Heidi, particularly, I'd like to go to you because I wondered whether you could, whether I could ask you where you think public services in the UK fit into the story, particularly the health sector. So to what extent can we set the agenda at a national level and lead the way by example?
I think we're ideally placed. One of the statements in the delivering a net zero national health service that we talk about is that the UK is leading the world on this. We want to be the first net zero national health service. And I think, again, if you think about the size and scale of opportunity in terms of the number of people we employ and the number of people we interact with on a day-to-day basis, if we can have conversations and even by nudge theory shift them a little bit, that is a huge potential impact we can have. And if we don't kind of almost set that scene in terms of for the expectation of this is a UK value, this is what it means to be a part of the UK, is to have this as part of almost your psyche, then it makes it much harder to achieve for anybody in the country, let alone a small individual company trying to go out on their own. So you think about some of the startups that have had real success on the back of their I'd say green credentials, but it's a phrase I hate. That if you've not got a willing public who are kind of along that journey with you, you've not got a market. And some of this is about creating markets. With our size and scale, we're able to help create those markets to deliver this. And again, I'll go back to the PPN that we've mentioned a couple of times with the carbon reduction plans that companies are going to have in place for contracts over 5 million. It's also a trickle-down effect because companies who are bidding for £5 million contracts are not just bidding for £5 million contracts, they're bidding for contracts probably quite significantly smaller than that. But once they've got a carbon reduction commitment and a carbon reduction plan, it doesn't matter what size of the contract they're bidding for, they've got that there. And again, it makes them more attractive in other markets. As consumers and the UK population as a whole becomes much more invested in this, and this is an area where we can influence to make them feel more invested in it, that's something they're going to be demanding in their everyday lives, not just from public services. And again, as part of the that delivering a net zero NHS, we have put out a very clear message within that document saying if you are not in line with our ambitions within the next 10 years, we will no longer be buying from you. And it's not saying we won't buy from you tomorrow, but it's giving people time to kind of align themselves with the direction of travel, because I think that's important. You can't expect everybody to change from their current kind of trajectory, if they've even got one, overnight. You need to give them time. But over those next 10 years, we are going to see the bar shift again, the goalpost shift again, as we tighten up on exactly what we're expecting from people. And we've got to bring people with us on that journey, not alienate them from the beginning.
No, thank you. And it's absolutely right. But not everyone has that national footprint. And I was wondering whether I could go to Peter to ask, what more do we have to do at a sort of a local level, from a local level perspective, about what a real difference that we can make sort of on a sort of a smaller footprint, on what sort of impacts can we make?
Yeah, I think every action counts, really. I mean, people often say to me within my organisation, we can't change the world, but we have to, in effect. And actually, a local authority like Wakefield is not insignificant. If you look at per capita emissions, we're probably responsible for 1 out of every 200 tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions in this country, potentially, roughly speaking, of course. Don't hold me to that. But collectively, if you aggregate all of those local authorities, that obviously has a huge impact. We service the needs of citizens within our respective areas, and we shape the way places look, if we've got sustainable communities, sustainable mobility, we have a huge influence. We've obviously already alluded to the fact that public sector organisations have huge buying power, really, and that buying power, if you look at a local authority, some of them will spend in excess of £500 million every year on procurement. So patently, that can have a large impact if you think of it in terms of using that money positively to leverage change within markets, industries, and sectors. There's a lot of potential there to do good things, I think. The other thing is that local authorities have great networks in terms of partnerships, working with local communities, cross-working in terms of multi-agency approaches with the likes of the NHS. So we can bring a lot of people together to the table to start having these conversations about what needs to happen. I think we can also empower citizens to actually take action in their own right. I mean, a lot of areas, I'm sure it's not unique to places like Leeds and Wakefield, but there's a lot of litter picking volunteer activity now, which wasn't around a year ago, and people are really enthused about it, to the extent that actually it's costing the council money because people are collecting litter off private land, and then that's going into our figures. But it's a positive thing, and it's great to see. And I think that upswelling of support for this agenda is encouraging. And I think people want to get involved in other things, such as tree planting, for example. And that's citizen-led work, which can actually save money as well in terms of bringing people on board and getting some of that free support where people can see the fruits of their labour and feel like they're making a contribution. And then just a final point, which isn't about localism, I think, is the fact that we do have a massive responsibility as a country. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We've caused a lot of these problems globally. If you look at our graph, the trajectory in terms of carbon emissions, it's going down year on year from 1990, but that is largely because we have outsourced a lot of our manufacturing emissions to the developing world. So when people say that China and India are complicit, it's actually us that's complicit because we want that cheap labour that makes the things that we consume. So actually we've got a huge moral responsibility because we haven't even reached peak carbon yet. If you look at the graph, even with the lockdown, the economic downturn linked to COVID, it's still at best probably plateaued, the year-on-year emissions between this year and last year and the year before. So we need to really start making that line go down on a global scale. It's not enough if we become a net zero country by 2040, 2050, that's useless because the carbon emissions don't respect boundaries, do they? We're not immune to the effects of climate change. So I think it's an important point to make.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. Absolutely, that is a really good point to make. Just conscious of time, but I think I will ask this question, John. Where can we collaborate more strongly as a group to push things forward?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd 100% endorse everything that Peter just said, and I think that's a really important starting point for building that collaboration. So there's that working as conveners locally with all of the organisations in our local area, businesses, for example, and residents, and looking at the power of citizens' assemblies that we've seen recently. But so in some of the work that we've done in London since the pandemic is that the convening what's been called the London Recovery Board, which is a range of stakeholders from across the city, from the public sector, private businesses, community groups, charities, and there's also a group of anchor institutions, so including the 32 boroughs, the universities, the NHS, and those anchor institutions combined have a public an annual spend of around £73 billion. So there's a huge amount of work that we can do in partnership to drive markets in the way that people have described to sort of, and that has really a ripple effect as well. And I think that also, as has been mentioned, we have that wider duty, but also a real power for things that we do to have a wider ripple effect, and looking at the way that regions and local governments and cities have, I think, been driving a lot of the time the agenda around the environment over the last few years, both locally and across the country, but also globally. Looking at the UN's process for voluntary local reviews, and the way that Bristol is now really a sort of seen as a global leader as a city in sustainable development. The ICLEI network has a carbon procurement conference taking place just next week, the C40 Cities group. So there's really a sort of a global stage for our organisations, I think, to have that influence and sort of drive that debate forwards. And I think it's, in the run up to COP26, I think it's a really key time for us to be sort of taking part in those conversations.
Thank you. I'd see, we could talk all day, couldn't we? But I see that we have some questions from the audience. So I'd like to sort of turn to some of those questions. We have a couple around the supply chain. Perhaps I can address these to you, Michael, because I know that you've touched on sort of supporting sort of down the supply chain. So we've got a question around, from a Scope 3 emissions relating to supply chain, what approach have the panel used to quantify these emissions? And we also have a question around, how would we begin to tackle carbon emissions from your supply chain, and then report these reductions against your supply chain carbon footprint? Michael, would you like to sort of start us off?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of quantifying, so again, across our 4 partners, because we use TOMS in terms of commitments for social value, carbon is within there, and there is a metric or a couple of metrics within that menu for how many CO2 tonnes and whatnot are offset or saved. I think it does perhaps need to go a bit further. So I think there's only a small kind of number around the carbon side. But I think that's how we in fact quantify it through the tool. I mean, how that then comes back within our partners and matches up with their, because that's how I can't answer in terms of how the council looks at its own carbon emissions. But I think there's a conversation, to have, I think, within our 4 partners about how we can add what our supply chain is up to within what the council is up to. If that answers the question.
Lovely, thank you. Do any of our other panelists, would you like to sort of answer that? What are you beginning to do to tackle carbon emissions down the supply chain?
I can jump in if you like.
Yes, please do.
I've mentioned numerous times the Delivering Net Zero piece of work that was published in October. So they have some very high level NHS-wide numbers in them. I obviously work for a specific trust, so what I've commissioned some consultancy piece of work to answer that very question, to quantify against all of our spend where the carbon is and what the carbon emissions are from it. There's numerous things I want to do with that report, but what I want to be able to do with it is to find out where our hotspots are, where are the really bad products or services that we are using or doing that are contributing most. I can then give an itemized, detailed kind of set of objectives to our procurement teams and other departments that are using those services to say, look, this is the data, this is where the carbon's coming from. Is it a case of changing our behaviour and how we do something, or a particular procedure that we're undertaking or activity, or actually is it the products that we're using or the servicing we're buying? So it's a conversation with our suppliers to say, right, this is the issue. What are you doing? How can you? Or is it bad data? Do we actually need to go down a particular product and do a specific carbon footprint of a product to understand its life cycle, where the carbon in it is, and have you made changes already that mean in the next year, 2 years, that product is going to be significantly lower? But you've got to have that big data set to begin with to almost prioritize your workload and put your resources where they're going to be most effective. Because again, as mentioned before, we don't have infinite resources to kind of do everything at once. We've got to prioritize and kind of go for your big hitters first.
Thank you, Heidi. We've got another question, actually. Does the panel have any examples of what has been successful in a procurement exercise, for example, specific question or evaluation method? And is there any tendency to sort of offload this responsibility down the supply chain to the supplier? And perhaps John, would you be able to address that?
Yeah, so I think it partly depends on the scale of the contract. So I think a lot of the time we've put in clauses which are a bit sort of catch-all and say, kind of show us how you're going to reduce carbon emissions. And I think we're starting to do a bit more work with some of the larger contracts to get a little bit more into the nuance of some of those things. I mean, especially if it's a contract which is focused around something like buildings, and we'd sort of look at particular standards, and it almost becomes its own process outside procurement. We've been doing some really interesting stuff with grant schemes recently. Part of the Green New Deal funding sort of initiative that's come out of the recovery program is a piece of work called Future Neighbourhoods 2030, which is giving local authorities funding to create sort of green and healthy neighbourhoods, and working with a set of pillars that invite sort of expressions of interest, take bidders on a bit of a journey, work out how all of the different issues tie up, and sort of more nuanced scoring, bring in different policy experts to sort of score the different relevant pieces has been quite interesting. So I think that it's slightly horses for courses in terms of the nature and size of the contract from our point of view.
Thank you. We have another question. I think it might go to Heidi, because you were talking about nudge economics before. The question is: there have been discussion around behavioural change being fundamental to reaching our climate goals. Have you found any strategies effective, and do you find that your decision makers and communities are fully on board?
Oh, what a question.
It's quite a big question.
Think,
you don't have to own
yeah,
it.
it is. No, I think it comes down to stakeholder analysis for me. So understanding who am I trying to influence in context. Again, so I work for Northern Care Alliance. We've got nearly 20,000 staff, and obviously over 1 million people who we are the secondary care provider for. So you can't treat them all as one. They don't have the same background, they don't have the same levels of understanding or motivation or care around this particular agenda. So you have to segmentalize it, which is a really bad word, but kind of break it down into what, for the different groups of people, what is it I want them to do? What is it specifically I need them to do, or behaviour I need them to change? And focus on, because you can't do everything at once. You've got to focus your attention. So in some cases, it's for some it'll be around how do we change the care pathways. So rather than every time somebody comes into outpatients, they physically need to come through the door of the hospital building. Well, who do I need to influence? It's around the consultants and doctors who felt the need to have face-to-face contact. Obviously, the last year has completely and radically changed that approach and that belief. There are still times when you need to see a patient face to face, but actually, if you've got to see somebody 5 times now, you may only actually physically need to see them face to face once, and the rest can be done through something like a face to face webinar or phone call. So for that particular group of people, the type and approach of messaging and conversation you have is very, very different from the domestics who are putting in bin bags into different bins and making sure they keep them separate. Because again, completely different kind of agenda item when it comes to climate change, but both have a real significant impact. So for that for me, is you can't have a one size fits all. You've got to kind of understand the types of message you're trying to get to, who you're trying to get to, and the type and medium of communication for that.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm afraid that's about all the time that we have for audience questions. I know that there might be a couple more, and if there are, we'll make sure that we'll try to address them offline. But before we close the session, I'm keen to return to our guest speakers to hear from each of you about what your takeaway messages are from our discussion today. I know particularly for me, what struck me was sort of the entrenched behaviours that Heidi was talking about earlier, and it has made me think about my own behaviours and what I do. And I was wondering whether we could find out if you have a takeaway message, particularly from today. So let's start with you, Michael. We haven't heard from you in a while. What would your takeaway message be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to kind of digest from today. I think my takeaway message is that this is a global issue, and if we really truly want to be a carbon neutral organisation, I think it's not just thinking about our borough and what goes on within, and from a local authority point of view, and what goes on in the borough. I think and tier one suppliers, it's looking at that tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers. Where is the product actually coming from, and how is it being made? And I think that's it's going to be complicated, I think, to kind of tackle that. But yeah, I think if you really, truly want to be a carbon neutral organisation, it's going down that the full supply chain to tackle it and find new ways and new ways of making things. So yeah,
thank you. Yeah. Peter, considering everything that we've discussed about where we've come from and where we're going now, what are your takeaway messages?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of promise in terms of what's happening at the moment. There are plans, there are foundations that have been set, but I think we're at a bit of a crossroads. And that's my takeaway, that if you think about what's happened in the past, a lot of it's been peripheral. Case studies, demonstrators, pilots. Now, everything we need to do, it has to be integral. The carbon reduction journey that we're going on, otherwise we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve. And that's a challenge, really, getting people to understand how big this is. It's complete systemic change within every organisation, within society, within the economy. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but we are at least having dialogue. And you can see it in the media in terms of what the government is saying. Things are definitely changing, but is it happening fast enough? My takeaway is it still isn't, but at least things are happening in the right direction, and we're having things like a net zero week, obviously led by yourselves, which I think is great to see.
Thank you, Peter. Heidi, your takeaways?
I think I'd build on Peter's point. Again, it can't be that we have a net zero week and that's it. Net zero has to just be part of how you life now, whether it's your tenders, whether it's your strategy, whatever it is within your organisation you're doing, net zero has to be the thread through all of it.
Thank you. And finally, John.
The first thing for me is learning. I've already taken away so much from what different colleagues this morning have been working on, and I think there's so much more that we're all doing that probably none of us know about each other. So I think there's a huge piece there in sharing, and I suppose building on that, the point around collaboration, and sort of Michael alluded to this idea that we really have this opportunity to sort of build partnerships within cities across the UK and even beyond, to sort of drive this agenda forwards collectively. And I think that's a really powerful position for us to be in.
Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed today's discussion. It's been an absolute privilege to open Net Zero Week with this panel session with this group of guests. So thank you to my guests today, Peter Leighton-Jones, Heidi Barnard, Michael Sellers and John Emmett. Also, thank you to the audience for being with us today. We hope you have really enjoyed this discussion as much as we have enjoyed delivering it. Please do check out the rest of the sessions this week and join in the conversations on social media. But in the meantime, thank you and goodbye for now.